Free will does not mean one will, but many wills conflicting in one man. Freedom cannot be conceived simply. The Stanley Parable was originally released as a mod for Half-Life 2 in 2011 and as a standalone game shortly after. In 2014, it went on to win Game of the Year. So what makes the Stanley Parable so special, so different, so memorable? Many people might answer that they were impressed and engaged by the choices embedded in the plot that led to one of over 20 absurd and often funny endings. But what exactly did these choices do? Do they really give the player autonomy, or just the sense of it? This is the Stanley Parable and the Authoritarian illusion of choice. The first main choice you, as a player, arrive at in the Stanley Parable is the iconic 2 doors. You arrive. The narrator tells you that Stanley, your avatar, chooses the left door, but you decide to go right. Did you just make a reflexive choice? Did you assert that you were a player and not your avatar? Did you make a choice that changed the outcome of the story? To you, the player, it certainly feels like it. You are no longer passive, but rather you are seen by the game. You are examined and spoken to, allowing you to follow the narrator like an automaton or to show resistance. But you've gone the wrong way, and the game ends minutes later. Does it feel like you made the wrong choice? Perhaps, for a moment, before the loading page reminds you that the end is never the end, is never the end, is never the end. And off you go, making new choices and finding new endings. But with a little thought and a little cynicism, the cycle starts to seem punishing. The story no longer seems neutral, but rather the mechanics of it operate to discipline, to punish, and to educate its subjects. These are didactic choices wearing reflexive masks. Hang on. To clarify, a reflexive choice is one that influences the flow of the narrative, which in turn influences the following choice you, as a player, have to make. A didactic choice, on the other hand, is one in which there is a correct choice to be made according to the author of the work, one which offers narratively satisfying and ludic rewards. Okay, back to it. To educate. Interesting. What is the Stanley Parable trying to teach its player? The biggest clue to breaking down the narrative power of the Stanley Parable is right in its name. A parable refers to a story told in a catechistic teaching, much like in Sunday school, and highlights the difference of a reflexive and a didactic choice. In short, the game wants to teach you to make the right choice, even if you didn't know there was one. Just like in the biblical parables, we, as the participants, are meant to take away a certain moral code. Take, for example, the Good Samaritan in the book of Luke. We, as the receivers of a teaching, are intended to understand that the Good Samaritan is who we aspire to be. We are meant to stop and help harmed travelers rather than simply passing by. This is indicated by the Good Samaritan being granted a continued narrative. We do not follow those who do not help. Rather, the story follows the person we are supposed to aspire to be. While you can certainly make any choice that the game allows, you are taught which choices are better based on narrative punishment, much like in the parable. The cultural precursor to games like the Stanley Parable are game books, the most famous brand being Choose Your Own Adventure. These provide an excellent demonstration of narrative punishment. When you encounter a choice in these books, you certainly choose, but the correct choice is the one where you live, granting you a continued narrative. The best and right choice is the one with the longest narrative branch. While not all endings in the Stanley Parable are short when you're wrong, they are certainly disconcerting, mocking, and sometimes almost cruel. Again, the 2 doors illustrate this entire concept wonderfully. There's a binary, an implicit and an explicit, a right and a wrong. Now, does the Stanley Parable understand this about itself? Of course, Wrenden knows you have already made a choice to play this game, and therefore, submit yourself to whatever branches of narrative he chooses to lay out for you. This self-awareness is possibly best illustrated in the museum ending. Here, the main narrator attempts to kill Stanley by forcing him to walk into a working factory press before a different narrator takes control of the game. This new narrator transports Stanley to a museum that outlines in great detail how Wrenden made the game, saying, "When every path you walk has been created for you long in advance, death becomes meaningless." This ending, this exposure of the structure of the game, shows the player that the navigation of branching paths is akin to being trapped in a maze with no exit, a maze you chose to be part of. The only way to truly make a choice in this parable is to not play it at all. It is through this seeming paradox that interactivity becomes an act of control, rather than one of liberation. This leads well into Manovich's ideas of standardization. Here, I will quote Sarian and Manovich at length. Manovich observes in the language of new media that the rise of interactivity forms part of a modern trend to externalize mental life and to subject it to standardization, making it easy for a developer to engage in the objectification of internal, private mental processes and to thereby equate them with external visual forms that can be easily manipulated, mass-produced, and standardized on their own. The result is a system that forces a user to follow a pre-planned path in that it forces a user to inhabit the mind of the designer and mistake it for their own. Hang on. One more time. In short, essentially, game developers make a tangible version of their inner worlds for players to participate in. And when one chooses to participate, they give up the autonomy of choice. By choosing to play a game, you as a player have accepted that you can only make choices that have already been chosen for you. So, was it worth it? Sure, it got Game of the Year, but what kind of impact did the Stanley Parable have culturally? Perhaps its biggest claim to fame is driving what Ennslin calls literary games into the spotlight of indie game design. While certainly not the first of its kind, the Stanley Parable paved the way for other indie narrative games like Dr. Langsakov the Tiger and the Terribly Cursed Emerald, The Beginner's Guide, and Dear Esther. The Stanley Parable has held a place in the hearts of many indie gamers for years, and is critically considered to be a turning point in how complex, confusing, and beautiful games can be. So, if life is a sum of all of your choices, what are you going to do today?